Okay, so hello everyone, people here in the classroom as well as the members who are joining us online. So it's time for us to start. I welcome you everyone at the second Tolkien colloquium organized by our University Department of English and American Studies at Constantin the Philosopher University in Nitra. This year, the topic of the colloquium, as you could see on the program, is emotions in Middle-earth. I wanted to orient it this way because it's related to the research that I do, and it's an interesting topic to explore how the various emotions are depicted in Tolkien's work and how they can influence us as readers. Can everybody hear me, people who are online?
Yes.
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 Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. So today we have 5 presentations. I will be starting as the first speaker, then we have 2 students from our university, and finally 2 international guests. So without further ado, I will start with my presentation. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I will be just talking. The topic of my presentation is wrath and anger in Hobbit. So we will be starting with the more negative emotions and proceeding slowly through despair, fear, through the more joyful emotions such as happiness, which we will end with. So, talking of wrath, I approach my topic primarily as not as emotion, but as a vice, because this is what I dealt with in my previous research. So wrath is often called more commonly as anger, and it's an emotion that arises when a man perceives something as being hurtful to him. Some theologians define it as a feeling of unpleasantness which creates, quote, a great deal of physical tension which seeks action and tends to engender both impulsiveness and a sense of power and self-assurance. Such depiction of anger is based on the general psychological understanding of anger as a basic emotion, and as such it has important evolutionary significance. It complements the assurance of survival by orienting and giving meaning to one's intentions, and it can be even beneficial to one's survival when it's well managed and used wisely. Other theologians, however, define it in more simple terms, unrelated to the psychological understanding, and then claim that anger is just a feeling of desire for revenge. However, in Christian understanding, anger is not just that. Even Christian theology understands that anger is a passion, and passions as such, they are not morally distinctive, or they are morally neutral. The virtuousness or viciousness of anger or any other emotion depends rather on what is the object of anger and in what extent the anger is exercised. So, for example, when a person is angered by witnessing some unjust or sinful behavior, or if the behavior that he witnesses is too great in comparison with the original harm inflicted, this kind of anger is considered to be virtuous and can be also praiseworthy under certain conditions. It is called zealous anger or even holy anger. And in the Bible, it is reflected in the famous story when Jesus got angered by the various sellers and merchants who were turning the holy temple in Jerusalem upside down and making it just a selling place. So this kind of zealous anger, it's even expected for a person to feel a proportionate amount of anger if they witness some kind of evil going on, because it proves that as humans we are able to distinguish between good and evil, and we consider the evil things as evil and desire proper punishment for those witnessed evil things. Such desire for punishment is perceived as corrective and deserved of punishment, and it is necessary to punish it in concord with the civil law. On the other hand, the vicious forms of anger, they are identified if somebody is either angered by witnessing a behavior which is not considered sinful or evil, or if you desire to inflict greater harm than what actually was inflicted to you, or if it is inspired by some kind of underlying mistakenly understood situation, if you take anger on an innocent person, or if you take anger of somebody just because you dislike them generally, or feel general malice towards them. Talking of Tolkien's work, I will focus primarily on the analysis of anger in the novel The Hobbit, where we can say that anger is one of the most important vices depicted in the novel. Of course, it's not the primary motivation of action in the novel. The primary motivation is usually caused by the vices of greed and pride. But anger as a vice is one of the most visualized and vocalized ones in the novel. And that is not surprising because anger, considered generally as a vice, is one of the most physically expressive and confronting vices. And therefore, in terms of literature, it allows or provides for a wide array of events that can serve as conflict-building literary devices. Similarly, as I said, because in reality we distinguish two forms of anger, the more positive one and the negative one, we can identify both forms also in Tolkien's work. Naturally, the forms of vicious anger are usually associated with the villainous characters in the story, such as the orcs, wargs, spiders, trolls, and the dragon. And the just forms of anger, they are associated with the heroes of the stories, that is, dwarves, hobbits, elves, and men. The just forms of anger and vengeance play a particularly significant role in the plot development, especially in relation to the race of dwarves. This can be seen already in the first opening chapter of the novel, where the dwarves, after they visit Bilbo for the first time, they sing a song which kind of explains the purpose of their quest. Here they describe how Smaug the dragon destroyed their ancient city, splendid kingdom, killed many of its inhabitants, acquired the place and all the treasures that were found within for himself, and this resulted in the dwarves having to become just wandering beggars. And so it's understandable that they seek revenge on Smaug and seek to reclaim their ancient kingdom back. However, the way how it's depicted in the poem, it makes the anger maybe a little less significant or prominent in the context of the poem, whereas greater emphasis is put on the desire to reclaim back the lost possessions, and so it's associated with the vice of greed. The importance of revenge and how important it is for the dwarves is only explained by Tolkien in his later writings that were published after The Hobbit was finished and after he was writing or working already on The Lord of the Rings. And eventually these writings appeared as a part of the appendices in The Lord of the Rings and also in the Unfinished Tales. So in these pieces, we find a little bit a greater explanation of the backlore of Thorin's motivation to reclaim his ancient city. And here Tolkien was trying to downplay the greed of the dwarves as one of their defining personality traits, and instead focus more on the anger and desire of revenge as the primary motivation. He writes that particularly Thorin was literally burdened with the duty of revenge upon Smaug, and the dwarves take such duties very seriously. In the appendices, there's another story where revenge plays a very prominent role in the dwarven culture, and it is the Battle of Azanul-Vizor. This was not originally part of the Hobbit, the plot of the Hobbit novel, but in Jackson's recreation, he included it in the storyline to enrich the story. So the film viewers may be familiar with this instance. Basically, why the Battle of Azanul-Bizar happened was that the orc Azog killed Thror, Thorin's grandfather, who was the king at that time, and naturally the dwarves needed to revenge his death. The battle actually finished with Azog's death, the original inflictor. So when the dwarves wanted to pursue their revenge even further, one of their members, dying, Thorin's cousin, pointed out that the killing of the leader was already avenged by killing the leader of the orcs, so there is no more reason for revenge or for pursuing the battle further and having more casualties. And this kind of thinking that the proportionateness of the original harm towards the revenged harm is very important in Christian understanding as well, and it is one of the conditions how just revenge is defined. So in retrospect, this shows that Tolkien was trying to put greater emphasis on the motivating power of revenge instead of trying to, or he was trying to downplay the stereotype of dwarven greediness, which many critics were picking up on. Talking of valid grounds for vengefulness, we can see that the battle itself provided grounds in turn for the orcs to try to avenge the death of their leader, particularly Bolg, who was described as son of Azog. And even though he's just mentioned in passing in The Hobbit, his story is likewise depicted in the film version. Another instances are, for example, when the goblins were trying to defend or revenge the death of their king, or when Gollum was trying to take revenge on Bilbo for taking his ring away. However, talking of these races, Gollum, the orcs, and the goblins, due to their general malice, we cannot really speak of virtuous vengeance on their side. Because as Tolkien put it in one of his letters, and which is also in concord with the Christian teaching, that good actions by those who are on the wrong side cannot be justified or cannot justify their causes. And similarly, even if a person who is generally considered to be virtuous takes one wrong slip towards evil, it doesn't really take away all their virtuousness, it's just one mistake. Some of the scholars, for example, Rosebery, who likewise studied Tolkien's work, add that because of this distinction, the dwarves are morally superior to the evil races of orcs and goblins, and their superiority regarding vengefulness is also granted by their sober attitude towards vengeance. This means that before acting, they first have to, they don't act hot-headedly, but they ponder carefully all the different aspects and possible effects of their revenge, and only act when they are absolutely sure that this is necessary to do in order to establish the original honor and status. Rosebery, in one of his studies, defines 3 conditions for revenge in order for it to be justified. So first, the person who seeks revenge has to be generally considered a person of goodwill. They have to have proportionate grounds for their revenge, and they have to deliberate long and responsibly before acting. What he also notes is that, and what can be understood or identified in Tolkien's writing, is that for the dwarves and for Tolkien himself, in seeking revenge, important thing is the cooperation of reason with the right kind of emotions. So you shouldn't really act just upon your emotions, and in case that you would regret your actions later. This also matches the general understanding of just anger or revenge as defined by various theologians, including Thomas Aquinas. Nonetheless, the dwarf's approach to vengefulness is not entirely virtuous if we try to analyze it from the Christian viewpoint, because generally the church nowadays advises rather to forgive your enemies, to exercise mercy towards them, and not to pursue revenge at any costs, because such behavior would basically be sinful, and there is no knowing in terms of Tolkien's work what a dwarf will not dare to do for revenge or the recovery of his own. So such approach is totally not in line with the Christian understanding. On the other side, this shows that the dwarves as a race, or how Tolkien invented them, his idea was influenced both by the Christian elements as well as the elements that he adopted from Northern mythology, which was another important source of inspiration for him. For the ancient Scandinavians, duty or the search for revenge was considered to be almost a sacred duty, to the extent that if you didn't try to revenge yourself, it was considered a breach of their cultural laws and basically a sin. And this is something which is kind of observed also in the race of dwarves. Another facet of wonderfulness that Tolkien might have taken from Northern mythology is that he uses this quite a lot as a poetic theme, and that it is more literary effective and more superior as a literary device when the revenge is executed at the site of the original offense. So we can see in both of the mentioned cases of the Battle of Five Armies as well as the Battle of Azanul-Bizar, where the dwarves are trying to meet the ends of their revenge at the exact same spot where they were hurt at first. So at the bottom of the mountain of Azanul-Bizar, where King Thor was killed, they also killed their Azog, and at the bottom of the Lonely Mountain, where the dragon and Smaug stole their treasure, they are trying to reinstate their rightful ownership as well. In the novel, we can identify several more instances of just anger, particularly related to the positive heroes of the story, such as Bilbo, and we can definitely say that in the first chapters when the dwarves uninvitedly come into his house, they eat all of his food, they are noisy, and they insult him all the time. He definitely has grounds for being angry at them. And in turn, throughout the story or throughout the quest, we also see different cases of the dwarves being angry, rightfully so, at Bilbo. First, it is in chapter 2, where Bilbo tries to steal a troll's purse, which endangers the whole party. Next, in Mirkwood, when he's unable to save them when they are lost, or when they are imprisoned by the elves, they always complain about how he was able to save them in a very uncomfortable way, in flowing down in barrels. And actually, finally, they are rightfully angry when Bilbo goes to Dragons to Smaug's lair for the first time, and without a reason, he steals away one of the cups and triggers the Smaug's anger on them. However, these cases are just isolated instances of anger, and therefore they cannot be considered as displayers of vices. Rather, they are just proper displayers of the prevalence of emotions in that particular moments. However, when we talk about the dwarves and particularly of Thorin's distrust and irritation towards Bilbo, we can say that it converges towards the vicious side. In the later notes that Tolkien published, this general prejudice of Thorin against the hobbits and in general and Bilbo in particular is emphasized even more than it is in The Hobbit. And it is also associated with Thorin's pride. He considers the dwarves to be superior to hobbits. And his stubbornness in this disdain for hobbits is so big that eventually it angers even Gandalf, who is otherwise generally represented as a very patient character in the story. Luckily for Thorin, in the end, he is able to identify his prejudice. He comes to his senses, apologizes for his behavior, and reconciles with Bilbo on his deathbed. And now we can turn on to the vicious display of anger in the story. And as I already said, it's mostly associated with the villainous characters such as orcs, goblins, and so on. For the first time, this vicious form of anger becomes prominent, especially in chapter 2, in relation to the trolls. Later on, considered gravity-wise, the vice of anger escalates through the grievous anger of Gollum, later on the maddened anger of spiders and Mirkwood, destructive anger of Smaug, and we can say that it's generally epitomized by goblins and wargs. But back to the trolls at the beginning of the story. The trolls' anger is induced by the monotony of their everyday life, especially their lack of proper tasteful food that they would like, and also to their slothfulness to look for something better or a better place to live in. So this is what makes them permanently irritated and easily incited to quarrels. And the trolls seem to be even taking quarrels as a time of just, or as a way of just passing time if they are bored. And they don't really differentiate between whether they quarrel with, so to say, friends, the members of their own species, or some foes such as the dwarves. So this reveals their overall malice. Moreover, the anger that is displayed by the trolls is their secondary vice, which is inspired by their primary vice, which is gluttony. And this is supported by the fact that even though the trolls argue with each other, they fight with each other, they stop as soon as they spot somebody who becomes the possible source of their food, the dwarves. So it doesn't really matter how big their anger at each other is. The anger that they feel towards their enemies is still even bigger, especially when it's associated with their vice of gluttony. So this is also something that finally leads to the trolls' distraction, because as they argue and they are incited into argument by Gandalf's disguised voice, they fail to notice that the sun is rising, and eventually they turn into stone. This is in the novel also the first instance where the vicious behavior displayed by certain characters eventually turns into a catastrophe for them and brings on a tragic ending. This situation is similar when we think about the goblins, orcs, and wargs. In later chapters in the second half of the novel, when the dwarves are captured by goblins, they likewise sing a song which reveals the true nature of their behavior and their intentions with the dwarves. So it's obvious from there that the goblins or orcs, they hate everyone, and especially the dwarves, as that relates back to the historical clash between the orcs and the dwarves and the Battle of Esenolbizir. And moreover, they also enjoy incurring cruelty and violence. Towards their anger is adjacent such vices as industriousness, cunning, and craftiness, which the orcs and goblins use to invent various battle and torture tools and devices. In contrast to the later books, such as The Lord of the Rings, in The Hobbit, the race of goblins or orcs are depicted as less quarrelsome, and they are more cooperating among themselves and also with other races, particularly the wargs, which they unite with. So in The Lord of the Rings, we have instances, or it says that the orcs are so evil, so quarrelsome, and so eager to pick fights that they often attack even members of their own race, just if they are from a different tribe. And it's exemplified when Merry and Pippin are attacked when kidnapped by the Isengard orcs, who basically kill off all of the Mordor orcs in their party. And also in the scene when Sam enters the Tower of Cirith Ungol, and there are the two parties of orcs. One is from the Ungol's tower, and one is from Minas Ithil, and they eventually, for Sam's luck, kill each other. But when we look back at how the orcs are depicted in the Hobbit, as I said, they are more cooperative. Even though in their malice they likewise do not distinguish friends from enemies, similar to the trolls, still they are able to work towards the common goal more effectively by uniting with the dwarves. Another scholar, Tolkien scholar Jane Chance, claims that both the orcs and the wargs represent a brute form of anger because they regularly plunder human settlements in the wild, they murder all the inhabitants and basically all living beings they come upon, and they save only few whom they try to enslave. Their anger is definitely not proportionate to any cause that they may have against other races. And it's quite possible that the anger that they feel towards anybody else arises from their envy, especially the envy of better living conditions. So we can say that the orcs project their anger about their desperate lives onto everybody else who has their lives better than orcs themselves. And the same motivation can be also observed in the case of Gollum, who, as we know, is very self-isolated, living in the cave under the mountains, the Misty Mountains. He's addicted to the ring, and this is the reason why he is in such a wretched condition he is in. So he is angry with himself for being unable to change his fate. He's unable to give up on the ring. He's angry for his people from his original tribe repudiating him, and he's even angrier at anyone who would ever try to steal his ring from him. So both in Gollum and in the works, we can identify anger, which is also manifested on the outside in their disordered physique, and similarly also in the orcs. They are often described in the text as being of wild, often having a green flame or green flicker in the eyes, which are some of the physical expressions of anger defined, for example, even by Thomas Aquinas in his definition of anger. And in addition to that, Gollum almost constantly makes strange hissing and gurgling sounds and argues with himself, which is another sign of the anger having such a powerful impact over one's mind that it kind of turns you into paranoia. And Gollum also curses an incredible lot, and when he encounters Bilbo, he calls him a lot of nasty names. Speaking of the nasty names, this is something which also Bilbo uses, especially towards Smaug when he encounters the dragon for the first time, but also when he encounters the spiders in Mirkwood. But unlike Gollum, who does it just from sheer malice, Bilbo is more cunning, and he uses the name calling in order to trigger the anger of spiders and use it against themselves. So when we talk about the spiders and their display of anger, nothing much can be said that save maybe that the name calling is the primary trigger which irritates their anger, and more so even the fact that they cannot really see Bilbo when he insults them because he wears the ring. So this is what drives them crazy. Again, Jane Chance claims that the spiders in the story embody uncontrolled anger, and in spite of the fact that this anger dumps their reasoning down because they are easily misled out of their ordinary ways, in terms of the plot development, it doesn't really impact it in any negative way. As I already said, Bilbo displays certain cleverness because he uses the spider's anger against them to lure them away from their nests, and therefore he is able to save his friends, the spider's victims, the dwarves. So we can say that the spiders embody a very primitive and impulsive form of anger, and this can kind of reflect also their status on the social or natural hierarchy in the natural world, and their hierarchical primitivity, which, for example, if we compare the spiders to the trolls, they are both depicted as very primitive races. But because the spiders represent the lowest forms of life, they are, after all, just spiders, just form of insect, even though they are giant. So it shows that their brains are not developed enough to be able to feel any complex emotions, and therefore even like childish name calling is enough to provoke them into debilitating anger. Now, when we compare spiders with the barks, which both represent the animal kingdom, or even a dragon smaug, still we see the difference between their hierarchical position, that spiders and insects are on the lowest position. Then lizards, represented by smaug, are a little higher on their position, and the wargs, representing mammals, are even higher than that. So naturally, this is reflected in the ability of the wargs and the dragon to be able to feel or have more complex feelings and more complex reasoning. And we can say that they are able to weave more intricate revenge patterns in contrast to the spiders, who are able to only weave just spider webs. Nonetheless, the spider's anger is just the same wise as in the case of the wargs or smaug. However, in the spider's case, the anger or the gravity of their anger lies in the uncontrollability and reoccurrence of the anger fits. In the case of wargs and the dragon, it lies mainly in their malice and the disproportion of their anger to the original inflicted cause. And in terms of orcs and goblins, their anger arises primarily from their general malice. Now, when we talk about dragon, Smaug, we can see that his anger is really improportionate to the inflicted harm, because he's enraged by the theft of just one small insignificant cup. And he says that he would be never able to forget such a theft in 1,000 years. So this is something which triggers him to finally, after thousands of years, to get out of his lair and try to catch the original thief. And when he is unable to find Bilbo, the thief, he avenges himself on innocent people, the people of Lake Town, which he utterly destroys in fire. So Smaug's anger has definitely the most terrible effects due to his strength, but it is only the secondary motivation of his action. The primary motivation is his greed. Talking of the spiders and the trolls, the primary motivation is their gluttony. Talking of the goblins and wargs, as I already said, the primary motivation is their general maliciousness. And finally, the whole story culminates in the Battle of Five Armies, which is also the display of the greatest impact of anger as sin, as war is in general. And in this battle, the heroes on the good side, the dwarves, the hobbits, the elves, and the men, they are able to win only thanks to a divine intervention. So naturally and miraculously, the eagles arrive, Tolkien's favorite deus as Martina, and also the shapeshifter Beorn, and only this is what helps them to win over the orcs and the wargs. So the eucatastrophic moment is granted to these heroic races in the last moment, only primarily thanks to them being able to put their quarrels and their differences aside. As soon as they find out that they are pursued by the orcs and the wargs, they forget about all the greed and jealousness over the treasure, and they unite themselves together against their common enemy. They repent their vices and unite for the greater good. And moreover, I dare to propose that the greatest credit on the achievement of this eucatastrophic moment is achieved particularly by Thorin's change of heart, his repentance of his prejudice and his greed. And this is what allows for the good side to win after all. So in conclusion, I can say that in the story, there are several instances that warn us that vicious behavior can turn into a personal discatastrophe. And on the other hand, if you forget offenses to your enemies, it can help you to become a better person and achieve some good in life. So thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, feel free to ask. We can have about 5 minutes for that. If there are no more questions, we will move to the next presenter.
I have a question, Martina. I really was fascinated by your section on the spiders and their sort of interaction with anger. I suppose that's not a sort of instance I'd thought about before. I wonder if you think there is a certain degree of paradox, as there are so many unresolved paradoxes in Tolkien, that creatures like the spiders and at times the orcs are judged for their inability to control their anger, while at the same time, as you say, there seems to be a sort of racialized implication that they are not able to control their anger in the first place. Whether you think that was one of the crises he never quite got around to resolving, or maybe he did, I just don't know.
Well, yeah, it's debated, especially regarding the orcs, that to what extent they are able to exercise some kind of free will, or if they are limited in it in some way, or by dependence, or like Sauron or whatever. I don't think this is something which has been deeply explored so far in research. So I think this is a good or proposal for further research or area that can be researched and looked more deeply into it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, so thank you for the question, and then we can move to our next presenter. It's our master's degree student, Lenka Prágerová, and the topic of her presentation is Isolation and Despair in Lúthien's quest in Tol-in-Gaurhoth and Angband. So Lenka, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. But my research, it will be quite short because I was focusing only on Lúthien and her quest in Tol-in-Gaurhoth within Silmarillion. So it is just a little small part. But yeah, I'm going to share it with you guys. So basically, the story focuses on Lúthien quest in Tol-in-Gaurhoth that mirrors the descent into hell, where the isolation and despair prevail. And in this part, the focus will be on Lúthien's infernal journey that unveils the isolation she endures, the depth of despair she confronts. Her quest to rescue Baron can be seen as a form of isolation, which can be divided into multiple levels. Emotional, physical, and social. The emotional isolation was illustrated through betrayal, as Lúthien was betrayed twice, but I will come to that later also. This event triggers the isolation that was depicted in a sentence. Then Lúthien, perceiving that no help would come from any other on earth, resolved to fly from Doriath, and calm herself to him. So this sentence marks the moment when Lúthien learns about Beren's dire situation and her decision to leave Doriath to rescue him. And her departure from Doriath and the subsequent events she faces in her quest to rescue Beren can be seen as a form of social isolation, because she is separating herself from people, from her home and her father's protection to pursue a dangerous path. And this triggers emotional isolation when she was betrayed by Daron, and this act of betrayal isolated Lúthien further as it eroded the trust she had in those around her. But furthermore, King Thingol's reaction was filled with a combination of fear and wonder. He feared for his safety and well-being in a world outside where the powers of darkness were growing, and this fear drove him to take drastic measures in the form of constructing a wooden house high up in the beech tree called Hirilorn. And this tree was depicted that it had three trunks equal in girth, exceeding tall. No branches grew from them for a great height above the ground. A wooden house was built. Ladders were taken away and guarded. Basically, placing her in this elevated and enclosed space isolated her physically from the world below, and the fact that the ladders were taken away and guarded underscored the physical isolation that was imposed upon her. Hirilorn, which is a towering and ancient beech tree with smooth trunks and no branches close to the ground, has also, I would say, the symbolic meaning. The choice of Hirilorn as a prison symbolized the height and distance that separates Lúthien from the rest of the world, and the fact that it's a beech forest in the northern half of the kingdom also encompasses its remote and isolated nature. And while being imprisoned there, she was allowed contact with the outside world only through the servants of Thingol, who brought her necessary items. And this limited and controlled interaction with others further deepened her isolation. The second betrayal occurred when Celegorn and Curufin captured her and were holding her against her will. And there was mentioned in the book a sentence, and she was not permitted to pass the gate. And this sentence basically isolates her physically from the outside world. And she was not allowed to speak with anyone except for her captors, which was Celegorn and Curufin. And this restriction on her communication may deepen her sense of isolation, as she's cut off from her loved ones and from anyone who might aid her. But while physically isolated, she experienced emotional isolation as well. She is in a situation where her captors are plotting to increase their own power and ambition, and she is a pawn in their schemes. And this emotional isolation is compounded by her uncertainty about the fate of Beren and Felagund, whom she believes to be prisoners with no hope of rescue. And despite her physical and emotional isolation, Lúthien finds solace in her interaction with Huan. And Huan's loyalty and affection for Lúthien provide her with some emotional support during the captivity. And she speaks to Huan about Beren and shares her thoughts and feelings that allow her to connect with someone who can understand her. And her interaction with Huan serves as a lifeline that offers her a connection to the outside world and a source of comfort in her difficult circumstances. And to see if there's a connection between Bible and the history of and the story of Beren and Lúthien, one researcher noticed a harrowing of hell motif in in this event. So this narrative was created to address the question of what Jesus was doing during the period between his crucifixion and resurrection, and provides an imaginative and symbolic answer to the theological question. And according to the narrative, Jesus descended into hell to free the souls of the dead people who were held captive by Satan. And some authors use this event in their books, including Tolkien. And it was also pointed out that this motif is at the center of Beren and Lúthien's story. Particularly can be observed in the following passage that I would like to read. Then, thinking him already dead, she put her arms about him and fell into a dark forgetfulness. But Beren, coming back to light out of the pit of despair, lifted her up, and they looked again upon one another, and the day rising over the hills shone upon them. So here, basically, Beren is presented as a Christ-like figure, and because he revives from death. This resurrection parallels with his resurrection, and is suggested that Beren's revival also restores those he loves, similar to how his resurrection brought salvation. And this event takes place in Tol-in-Gaurhoth, that is described as a place where no living creature could pass without being observed, let's say, by Sauron. And is the description of Morgoth's terror filling the fields and woods of Beleriand suggests a land that is oppressive, fearful, and dangerous, and it's a place where powers of evil are in control and the inhabitants are subjected to a constant state of fear and darkness. And this place is connected with Lúthien despair because she believes that Beren is lost in the dungeon of Tol-in-Gaurhoth, and this despair is evident in her action and feeling as she seeks counsel from Melian and learns that Beren is imprisoned in the dungeons of the Isle without hope of rescue. And this revelation shatters Lúthien's hope and fills her heart with weight of horror. And this despair stems from the apparent impossibility of saving Beren from the clutches of Sauron and the evil forces that are in the fortress. She eventually finds him, and the following text I would like to also mention the isolation and despair that she was experiencing. So deep was his anguish that he lay still and did not hear her feet. Then, thinking him already dead, she put her arms about him and fell into a dark forgetfulness. And in response to her perception of Beren's being in deep despair, Lúthien's emotional state, I would say, deteriorates, and she puts her arms around him and falls into a dark forgetfulness. So this suggests that Lúthien is overwhelmed by the despair, and she perceives in Beren and becomes, let's say, emotionally overwhelmed herself and falls into a deep sadness. So basically, to conclude this, Lúthien's quest can be seen as a metaphorical even descent into hell, and her journey reveals the isolation she endures on emotional, physical, and social level. Emotionally, she experiences betrayal, while physically she is isolated in a wooden house in a high tree. And socially, here the interaction and control and limited. The isolation represents the inner turmoil and emotional hardship. And furthermore, parallels can be drawn between Lúthien and Christ's harrowing of hell motif that emphasize themes of resurrection and redemption. And the dark oppressive nature of Tol-in-Gaurhoth, it reflects despair and fear Lúthien faces in her quest to rescue Beren. And yeah, that would be it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And again, there's a space for some questions if anybody has anything, or even from our audience here in the classroom. I also want to mention that what Lenka today presented is part from her diploma thesis research, and likewise our next presenter, Mário Marcík, he's also our master's student, and what he's going to present on fear in the Lord of the Rings is likewise part of his thesis research. So if there are no questions for Lenka, we can proceed to Mário's presentation.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I have actually a presentation, so if I can share it, it would be nice. Share this. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me and for this opportunity to speak at this colloquium. My talk is mainly concerned with fear in general, and I want to examine the potential influences of cosmic horror on the entities within the Lord of the Rings, with the connection with Lovecraft. I will be most of the time generalizing the attributes of these entities from Lovecraft's work for the sake of simplicity. So let's start with what I will be talking about. I will be talking about briefly horror as a genre, about fear of the unknown, Lovecraft's work, and we will then jump into the comparison and the attributes from the Lovecraft on the creatures or entities that we have here, the Nazgul, the Watcher in the Water, and the Balrog. So what is the fear? Or what is fear, basically? Fear is a deeply intricate and multifaceted emotion that covers a spectrum from excitement to terror and is studied across various fields, including psychology, neuroscience, sociology, and anthropology. It is influenced by diverse factors like context and individual psychology. The deep significance of its connection to the other emotions and its personalized nature highlights its crucial role in human experiences. Fear holds a significant thematic and narrative importance in literature, offering insights into characters' psyches, societal fears, and existential concerns. In Tolkien's work, fear is a part of his narrative, serving as a catalyst for character development, shaping the tone and atmosphere of key scenes and reflecting deeper philosophical and ethical themes. Horror as a genre, having its roots in ancient folklore, has exhibited remarkable evolution and captured an enduring fascination with fear. Originating from folklore traditions, horror literature has continually adapted, embracing supernatural and psychological elements alike. Throughout history, several key periods have propelled horror evolution. In the Romantic era, authors like Hoffman and Poe elevated horror through psychological symbolism, blurring the boundaries between reason and madness within everyday reality. Horror, as described by Poe, encompasses elements designed to provoke fear, dread, and unease, often linked to the unknown, darkness, death, or supernatural occurrences. Lovecraft defines horror as a primal emotion inherent in human nature, and highlights that it is not just an emotional response, but a recognized literary genre in his writing. It is aimed to evoke dread and contact with the unknown, which he is known for. It is how these elements work together that defines and amplifies horror, making it a genre that appeals by evoking both fear and fascination. The portrayal of horror in fiction serves as a powerful medium for expressing and exploring humanity's deeply ingrained fears, anxieties, and the unknown aspects of the human psyche. Both Lovecraft and Poe highlight that or how horror literature serves as a projection of these deep fears, providing a platform to confront and examine them. Of course, horror genre is not the only place to express fear. The projection of human psyche, fiction in general, inserts these concepts to enrich the story or push the narrative. The human fear in literature can be seen through, for example, reflection of the societal fears, which in fact reflect, for example, rules of privacy or totalitarian control, fear of the unknown, and existential dread, which may encompass the uncertainties of human existence, or fears that are more grounded, such as suspicion, betrayal, and deception, where characters often reflect our fears of betrayal, hidden motives, and deception, playing on our anxieties that stem from distrust and uncertainties in human interaction. Lovecraft says that the concept of fear of the unknown stands as a fundamental, deeply ingrained emotion within the human psyche, transcending time and cultural boundaries. It is a primal fear existing beyond learned experiences or the direct encounters, rooted in humans' response to incomprehensible elements. This notion is stressed by works of Lovecraft, of course, but also Poe, who emphasizes this fierce prevalence in literature and its capacity to evoke sense of emotion in readers. In essence, this fear is deeply interlinked with the human pursuit of predictability and control. When faced with uncertainty or lack of concrete information, individuals experience anxiety and distress due to their innate intolerance of ambiguity. It is considered an evolutionary supported fear impacting various domains like emotional behavior and cognitive. This implication is the fundamental nature of the fear of the unknown and a deep integration in human nature in various psychological disorders. Fundamental in this case, meaning inherent in individuals, often existing without the necessity of direct experience or learning. Talking about Lovecraft's cosmic horror, it delves into existential dread, the insignificance of humanity, forbidden knowledge, and incomprehensible entities beyond human understanding. It involves characters' fears of madness, collapsing reality, and the unknown horrors lurking beyond comprehension. Eldritch entities like Yog-Sothoth represent cosmic beings existing outside the boundaries of time and space. Other entities described in works of Lovecraft possess qualities that differentiate them from other types of horror creations, and this is important for our next subtopic. They often come from space. The geometric shapes are wrong with them, or the place they reside in. They have surreal or incomprehensible appearance themselves, unclear motivations. They can pose an existential threat to humanity and are beyond human understanding. So let's jump into the comparison, I would say. So while other aspects of Lovecraft's work, such as existential horror, madness, and forbidden knowledge, may not directly align with the tone and themes of The Lord of the Rings, a fear of the unknown, unsettling atmosphere, and certain entities resemble those within the setting of the story. The theme of eldritch entities possess a question of their thematic connection to those in Lord of the Rings. Their resemblance is in their appearance, or it may be in the nature of the entity. This comparison would suggest that the elements of cosmic horror and eldritch beings characteristic of Lovecraftian stories may be reflected in Tolkien's work. From the Fellowship of the Ring, three stand out in this regard: the Nazgul with their otherworldly and mysterious nature, Watcher in the Water with the resemblance to Lovecraft's sea-dwelling horror such as Cthulhu, and Balrog as an eldritch primeval being. How do these appearances and natures of these compare to those in Lovecraft? The answer will be, well, drawn from similarities and differences, which will provide the base for the assessment of whether the beings could be considered cosmic horror entities or inspired by this subgenre. Let's start with the Nazgul. Their origins trace back to 9 mortal men, as we know, who were corrupted by Sauron's rings of power. Their connection to spiritual realm and their ability to inspire fear and despair in those they encounter contribute to their ambiguous nature. Their description by Tolkien and reaction by other characters to their presence provide an insight into their nature. They are described as white-faced, gray-haired creatures with basically silver crowns representing their status when they were alive. Their merciless eyes and long gray robes give them an otherworldly but also grounded quality. Encounter with the Nazgul often evokes a profound sense of fear and horror in characters and readers, similar to the effect of encountering Lovecraftian entities. They may be seen as the undead servants of Sauron and exist outside the realm of ordinary human experience, like creatures and entities in cosmic horror, serving some higher entity, probably. On the other hand, the Nazgul, while shrouded in mystery, of course, have clear motivations tied to their service to Sauron and his quest for the ring, or their quest for the ring, unlike the often inexplicable actions of Lovecraftian entities. The certain extent of their powers, their origins and motivations are known by the end of Volume 1. Unlike entities in cosmic horror that often define description, and authors purposefully describe them in more abstract terms, the Nazgul have more defined physical forms as hooded figures, riding horses, or when Frodo puts on the ring, we can see what lies beneath, making them less abstract in appearance. While the Nazgul inspire feelings of insignificance compared to normal people, their actions are more directly tied to the conflicts and events of Middle-earth, with less emphasis on the cosmic indifference. Moreover, noble characters such as Aragorn possess a power to face them and to further diminish their image as otherworldly entities or beyond comprehension. The Nazgul, although similar in some aspects to entities in cosmic horror, bear resemblance to specters or ghosts throughout their pale, expressionless faces. Their eyes convey a sense of coldness and detachment, similar to those associated with some spectral entities. So what about the Watcher? While it may appear as an octopus-like creature, its origins, intelligence, and true nature are largely mysterious. It resides in the dark waters outside the mines of Moria. Encounter with the Watcher in the water instills a sense of horror in characters described as literally rooting them in place, similar to the effect of encountering Lovecraftian entities. It has a physical form resembling, as I said, a large squid or an octopus. As warden of the dark waters outside of Moria, the Watcher possesses an ancient and otherworldly quality. As Gandalf remarks, I quote, "There are older and fouler things than orcs in the deep places of the world," in the context of encountering the Watcher. But again, when we look at the actions of the creature, in contrast to cosmic horror, the Watcher's motivations are more straightforward, as it serves as a warden or an obstacle preventing entry into Moria for the company. Unlike the often inexplicable actions of entities in cosmic horror, while Watcher's appearance is somewhat described as a large aquatic creature, it still maintains its elements of mystery, but it is more tangible. The Watcher's actions, again, while terrifying, are more directly associated with the disturbance by Boromir, as Frodo warns him in the text, I quote, "I am afraid of the pool, don't disturb it," with the emphasis on the what may lurk beyond, what may lurk beyond the visible world, beyond the what is shown. While initially its presence evokes a sense of horror and unknown akin to those in creations in Lovecraft, closer examination reveals more tangible characteristics. The Watcher's motivations, though mysterious, are alluded to be due to its dweller-like nature, tied to the particular lake in front of the entrance to Moria, rather than embodying the abstract indifference. Additionally, its actions are triggered by the disturbance caused by the characters and can be interpreted within a more conventional fantastic narrative. Thus, despite visual similarities, the Watcher ultimately aligns more closely with the archetype of a formidable beast or an warden. Let's jump to Balrog, or the Balrog, in the encounter on the bridge of Khazad-dûm. It's described as a monstrous being of shadow and flame. Balrogs were originally, as we know, Maiar, angelic beings, basically of great power, who were corrupted. This particular one is named Durin's Bane for its connection with the demise of Durin. This encounter with the Balrog evokes a sense of awe and fear, particularly in Legolas and Gimli, as for their previous associations or knowledge of the monster. On the first glance, as an ancient entity, the Balrog possesses an otherworldly quality again and exists beyond the realm of ordinary human experience, echoing many Lovecraftian entities. Balrog embodies a primeval force of chaos and destruction. As Glowing, one of the dwarves, says, I quote, "Too deep we delved there and woke the nameless fear," which reads as a description from Lovecraft, basically. The Balrog's motivations, while not explicitly stated, seem to resolve around defending its domain in Moria, where it slept until it was woken up. and destroying intruders, contrasting with the often inexplicable actions from cosmic horror. The Balrog's physical form as a great shadow, a man-shaped dark form with wings of darkness, resembling a fiery demon, is more defined compared to Lovecraftian entities that often defy description, making it again more tangible through the description that Tolkien provides. While encountering the Balrog inspires feelings of horror, particularly again in Legolas and Gimli, its actions are more directly tied to the particular conflicts and events of Middle-earth. Similar to other two entities that I covered, at first Balrog evokes an aura of horror and mystery close to Lovecraftian entities and creations, but its origins as corrupted Maiar, related to a fallen angel or demon, intertwined with the history of Middle-earth, making it more tangible, yet still malevolent force and presence. Balrog's motivations may be grounded in more concrete concepts, driven by his desires, power, and corruption. Its towering form, enveloped in flames, lacks the distinct qualities of eldritch horrors, embodying instead a tangible darkness and corruption. Its actions are driven by recognizable goals, such as defending its territory, as we can see Balrog does not come out of Moria, or seeking vengeance on those who woke it up. The Balrog ultimately may be seen as a corrupted angel or demon, an imp, serving as a symbol of eternal struggle between light and darkness. To sum it all up, while all three entities possess elements of cosmic horror, then their nature can be attributed to influences from other themes and other types of literature. Although being similar in some capacity, these three do not bear resemblance in some crucial aspects. For example, their appearance and nature is less real or incomprehensible than those in Lovecraft, and their motivations are more clear or are not beyond a human understanding. We can understand them quite well. And an important point is their resemblance to other types of creatures. The Nazgûl are more closely tied to the corruption of men and the power of the rings, resembling more ghosts, wraiths, spirits, or cursed souls. The Watcher in the Water is large aquatic creature that fits within the fantastic mythological world, and it is more similar to other creatures like Kraken or Leviathan. Balrog can be seen as a depiction of a demon, fallen angel, an infernal creature, or an imp, found in literature inspired by mythological and religious text. And that will be it for my part. Again, thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi. I was wondering whether the Watcher might have some connection with Dagon as well.
It may, but the comparison should be, or the comparison between those two have to be conducted in order to see the true differences. Yes, so I cannot tell you right now.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question.
I have something which I hope will, by the end, approach a question, though maybe it'll start off as more of a comment. I'm struck by the fact that while Tolkien has in the past few decades been sort of rehabilitated as a scholarly author, someone who it is acceptable to write things about seriously after a long history of being maligned as not really appropriate for academic discussion. I'm not sure that Lovecraft has received quite the same treatment. Maybe he has. I wonder if you think that's in part due to Lovecraft's reliance on randomness in his horror. You probably know that Yog-Sothoth is just scrawled in the corner of a manuscript as "what a horrible name," and that's how he came up with it. Whereas with Tolkien, everything was obviously much more linguistic. Do you think Lovecraft's lack of employment of linguistic techniques has held him back for being accepted more quickly as a maybe not canonized author, but adjacent to the canon author?
Yeah, that may be the true reason, but also, as we know, he was deeply racist. So that may also be the some kind of aspect that holds him back, as many people do not. Maybe when they hear the word or the name Lovecraft, they associated him with more like these types of realities of racism. In his writing, some of his writing is basically racist, as you may know. So yeah, the quality of his writing is in his ambiguity of defining these creatures. As you said, the Yog-Sothoth is very, very poorly described, not described at all. We only know of him or it, and that is a good quality, because through the descriptions of Tolkien, as I said, he described a lot about his entities, about his monsters, and that may be detrimental to the writing, as we know more about it, and it is less and less mysterious as the author in general describes more and more of it. Yeah, so yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a very good answer.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
I was also thinking about Ungoliant, because we don't know whether she comes from the void, whether she's just a large beast. We actually don't know anything about her.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. Yes, again, because it is to the extent of providing enough so that there is something to be to have as an entity, monster, and so on or something, and to describe it not as detailed, so to mystery vanishes basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Are there any questions? Are there any
very much. If there's no more questions, then we can move on to our next presenter, and also to more positive forms of emotions. So the next one is Daniel Kephart from the University of Rochester, so from the US. And the topic of his presentation is Whimsical Tolkien.
Yes, yes. And I will confess to being not a bit daunted by having to discuss whimsical Tolkien when surrounded by such a company of excellent presentations on maybe some of the more austere emotions. Well, I'll begin with a question. What are we to do with Tolkien's style? And we will attempt to advance the slide. Stiff, false, archaic, overwrought, and finally a real hindrance. quaint stuff. Such were the words of Harold Bloom in his introduction to an edited volume of criticism on the Lord of the Rings. And I'd like to follow my earlier question with another question. Why was Harold Bloom asked to edit such a volume? And I think that maybe has to be a question for another day, but I will confess that I imagine dollar signs factored into things somewhere. Today, we are examining instead the role of emotions in Tolkien's literature, which is to say that we examine his literary style and maybe its reception. That Tolkien's writings show an enduring interest in emotion cannot be denied, and nowhere do we see it better than in the opening chapter of The Lord of the Rings, wherein Bilbo undergoes a remarkable set of emotional swings as he wrestles with the idea of giving up his magic ring, his greatest treasure. The counsel, which he receives from Gandalf, is what eventually puts him over the edge and helps to provide a base for my topic today. The ring, Gandalf says, has got far too much a hold on you. Let it go, and then you can be yourself and be free. Gandalf's counsel, all of you probably already know, proves sage, and soon Bilbo is proclaiming, in yet another swing as he walks out the door, "Don't you worry about me. I'm as happy as I've ever been." And that is saying a great deal. But the time has come. I am being swept off my feet at last. So then, the first great triumph of the Lord of the Rings comes when a little man learns how to let go of the thing which has obsessed him, so that he might be swept away in the current, learning once again to experience the world from a place of lost control. In other words, he learns to be whimsical again. My talk today is entitled Whimsical Tolkien because I firmly believe that Tolkien is an author for whom whimsy is important. The famous origin of The Hobbit, you may know, was in a line that Tolkien capriciously scribbled down on the back of an empty exam paper submitted by a student. And the broader legendarium, I think, has never shook this sense of vivacious spontaneity. Some critics, we must acknowledge, see this attitude as infantile. Michael Moorcock, the English science fiction writer, considered The Lord of the Rings, quote, a lullaby. It is meant to soothe and console. It is mouth music. It is frequently enjoyed not for its tensions, but for its lack of tensions. It coddles. It makes friends with you. It tells you comforting lies. It is soft. And in the final analysis, Moorcock declares that Tolkien's work contains little wit and much whimsy. Poor. Moorcock's name-calling makes one wonder, I think, what is so especially virtuous about wit and what is so damnable about whimsy. Moreover, one wonders what is so wicked about lullabies. Moorcock has no answer on such a point, declaring instead simply that the great epics dignify death, but they did not ignore it, and it is one of the reasons why they are superior to the artificial romances of The Lord of the Rings, of which The Lord of the Rings is merely one of the most recent. These sorts of stinging barbs, I imagine, are familiar to many of us, though I imagine most of us experience them not in academic journals, but more often in the knowing and upturned nose of a colleague or a family member in response to that most horrific and unspeakable of all phrases, I study Tolkien. There is a sense among people, I think, that Tolkien is merely popular literature, and that popular literature is what people read without guidance from their betters, as Northrop Frye, that unexpected champion of romance, well put it. Frye might have been describing Moorcock himself when he wrote that popular literature, the guardians of taste feel, it is designed only to entertain. Consequently, reading it is a waste of time. Many literary critics today still have Platonic minds in the sense that they attach what for them are the real values of literature to something outside of literature, which literature reflects. Moorcock remains today a famous opponent of the spirit of Thatcherism in Britain, and identifying certain sentiments in The Lord of the Rings to which Maggie Thatcher might be amenable, loudly declaims the paucity of literary value in the work. But I'm not sure I can reconcile the critique that Tolkien's literature is little more than programmatic bread and circuses with the simultaneous critique that it is whimsical. That which is programmatic cannot, by definition, be whimsical. And so I'll risk falling afoul of the Platonic fallacy, which Fry warns to note, that programmatic thinking is rarely a positive ideal within Tolkien's fiction. Treebeard indicts Saruman for programmatic thinking. He's plotting to become a power, Treebeard says. He has a mind of metal and wheels, and he does not care for growing things except as far as they serve him for the moment. Many readers have observed intriguing eco-critical implications of these sentences, but for our time today, I think it is sufficient to note that Treebeard faults Saruman for treating the world mechanistically rather than organically, for refusing to dignify the capacity of growing things to behave other than according to plan. Contrast this with Gandalf, who praises Frodo for his ability to act other than Gandalf expects. Hobbits really are amazing creatures, as I've said before. You can learn all that there is to know about their ways in a month, and yet after 100 years, they can still surprise you in a pinch. I hardly expected to get an answer, not even from you. And those of us who have been rereading The Lord of the Rings for what feels like 100 years may be compelled to agree with Gandalf. Frodo's ability to behave in a manner inconsistent with his usual ways and habits, to embrace whimsical decision-making, even in such dire circumstances, astounds and delights the wizard. But the quintessential example of whimsy in Tolkien's fiction must remain Tom Bombadil, who, I'm saddened to say, has been widely allegorized or diminished by those who would render him purely programmatic, as though there could be anything programmatic about running around in the woods singing about your boot and your coat. I much prefer Tolkien's own statement in his letters that Tom Bombadil is not an important person to the narrative. But he represents something that I feel is important, though I would not be prepared to analyze the feeling precisely. As our previous presenter pointed out, sometimes there is an additional strength in ambiguity. Tolkien's language reveals that the very thing he feels, and I want to stress that word, important, is itself a feeling generated by Tom. And thus a discussion of Tom is immensely appropriate to our discussion today, which is so much about feelings. I suspect, albeit beyond proof, that the feeling Tolkien struggled to place was that of whimsicality. I would gesture, I suppose, towards Frodo's infamous discussion with Lady Goldberry in chapter 7 of the Fellowship of the Ring. He, Goldberry says, is the master of wood, water, and hill. Then all this strange land belongs to him? Frodo asks. No, indeed, she answered, and her smile faded. That would indeed be a burden, she added in a low voice, as if to herself. The trees and the grasses and all the growing or living things in the land belong each to themselves. Tom Bombadil is the master. No one has ever coddled Tom walking in the forest, wading in the water, leaping on the hilltops under light and shadow. Tom's own mastery originates not in his ability to rule, it seems, but in his capacity to escape rule, to indulge his own whimsies, which he does. He moves equally deftly, or at least equally unhindered, through forest, water, and hillside. Even the ring holds no power over him. He plays with it and makes it disappear before restoring it to Frodo, who by contrast is shown already to be under the obsessive power of the ring. Gandalf identifies Bombadil's freedom in the Council of Elrond, as well as his capricious nature, declaring that the ring has no power over him. He is his own master. And yet Gandalf acknowledges that if asked to take the ring into his care, he, that is Tom, would not understand the need. Such things, or forgive me, and if he were given the ring, he would soon forget it, or most likely throw it away. Such things have no hold on his mind. Tom's strength and his weakness come from his whimsy. In essence, Gandalf proclaims that Bombadil possesses, we'll use Moorcock's own words again, little wit and much whimsy. Yet he does so without the moral overtones. Whimsy is welcome in Tolkien's heroes, if not quite so universal as to be deemed a prerequisite qualification for entry into the group. Tolkien's lesser antagonists certainly seem to suffer from an absence of whimsy, a sort of plodding adherence to their master's wishes. At the end of The Return of the King, for instance, Saruman mocks Wormtongue for his slavishness. You do what Sharky says, always, don't you, Worm? Wormtongue protests that Saruman commanded him, perhaps hypnotically, to murder Lotho Saxfil Baggins, hissing, you told me to do it. You made me do it, in response to the wizard's disclosure to Frodo of the homicide of his relative. Such is the way with Tolkien's antagonists. They demand that their lesser surrender all agency, and then they detest them for it. And I wonder if that is not potentially a more subversive viewpoint on charismatic leaders and political power than Michael Moorcock is willing to grant Tolkien. Of course, there is still the matter of style to consider, and I am in sad agreement with Moorcock in his lamentation that a whole commercial genre exists today seemingly only to peddle off bad imitations of Tolkien's mythic approach, but I cannot share his conclusion that it is a sign of our dumber times that Tolkien stands with James Joyce as among the most recognizable authors of the 20th century. Bilbo Baggins may not create the impressive illusion of internality that a figure like Leopold Bloom manages, but neither does Joyce's Dublin exhibit the same enchanting ease of navigation to the reader unfamiliar with its streets and alleyways. The two authors undertake, it seems to me, not dissimilar projects in their analysis of the evolution of language and its literary effects on fashion. In Ulysses, this episode takes place in chapter 14, usually entitled Oxen of the Sun, in which Joyce traces what Patrick Hastings calls the ultimate authorial power flex, and demonstrates Joyce's unparalleled literary dexterity and depth of knowledge. Joyce estimated that he spent 1,000 hours writing it. 1,000 hours, Tolkien readers know, is light work. Even so, Hastings admits none of that makes it particularly fun to read. By contrast, Tolkien's own linguistic power flex spans the whole of his legendarium, while remaining so subtle as to be absorbed without second thought by the average reader. Very few of us notice that the Rohirrim are speaking Old English amongst one another on a first read, or that the names of their leaders are amusingly, perhaps hilariously literal. The Joycean and Tolkienian projects seem directionally opposed, in fact, with Joyce continually calling attention to the textuality of his work, while Tolkien's work generally, though not exclusively, suppresses it. Only by reading the prologue to The Lord of the Rings and its appendices do we find the spell broken and our gaze directed to the literariness of the book within our hands, and that only within the greater spell of the book's false history. Obviously, there never was a Red Book of Westmarch. The whole game is one of illusion, and it's a playful one at that. It makes one half wish to answer Moorcock in Tolkien's own words, drawn from his own long poem Mythopoeia. Yes, Tolkien writes, wish fulfillment dreams we spin to cheat our timid hearts and ugly fact defeat. To accuse Tolkien of escapism is to accuse a lamb of behaving sheepishly. I suppose it's true, but it doesn't much advance the conversation. For Tolkien, the game is always to assert the creative will in a playful manner, to see just how far literary conventions can be bent without losing their power to engage and even enchant the reader. Often this enchantment seems to require the author to conceal rather than display his literary expertise. It's worth remembering, after all, that the same poet who wrote, "Dawn came dimly on the dun beaches, the foam glimmering faint and ghostly, the tide was turning, the tempest waning, light leapt upward from long shadow, and walking on the water, waves kindled as glass glittering green and silver," and who wrote, try once again to advance the slide, out of doubt, out of dark, to the day's rising I came singing in the sun, sword unsheathing. To hope's end I rode, and to heart's breaking. Now for wrath, now for ruin, and a red night fall. Also wrote, Tom's leg is game since home he came, and his bootless foot is lasting lame. But Troll don't care, and he's still there with the bone he boned from its owner. Donor, boner, Tom's old seat is still the same, and the bone he boned from its owner. I draw the first selection from The Fall of Arthur, Tolkien's forgotten piece of Arthuriana and his finest poem. The second, probably more familiar to many of us, is Eomer's song, delivered on the Pelennor fields. But the final selection is from The Fellowship of the Ring, where it is delivered rather sheepishly by Samwise Gamgee. I'm not, as a rule, a great admirer of Tolkien's poetry in universal terms, but I think his poetic humility is something rarely encountered in the other great Anglophone writers of his century. T.S. Eliot shows us in The Wasteland that he understands perfectly the voice of the working class, but I don't think he dares to admire its diction quite so much as Tolkien, who clearly has a special affection for this little gardener poet, Samwise. It would be remiss, maybe, to label Tolkien the finest author of his century, but I don't think we should be embarrassed to at least think of him as a contender in the conversation. Well, with my time waning and at an end, maybe I should close by responding to Bloom's final criticism, his notion that The Lord of the Rings is quaint stuff. One must be careful. That word, quaint, is rather perilous, loaded down with heavy meanings. The OED provides a sense of the usual modern use of quaint as attractively or agreeably unusual in character or appearance, especially pleasingly old-fashioned. That's the modern use. But among the crowded meanings now rendered obsolete, we find also that quaint may mean clever, ingenious, wise, knowing, skilled. Quaint may even mean strange, unusual, unfamiliar in character or appearance, curious, remarkable, mysterious. I again am drawn to think of Lovecraft by our previous presentation. But for myself, I find none of these definitions satisfactory in characterizing Tolkien's literature, which seems too full of personality and character, of capricious invention and slow refinement intermingled. Instead, I prefer to summarize Tolkien's work with another word, not unprovocative in its own right. For while J.R.R. Tolkien's writing is sometimes sublime, sometimes problematic, often profound, in my own experience, it never fails to be at heart whimsical. That concludes my time. Thank you very, very much for listening.
Thank you very much. So do we have any questions? There seems to be no questions in the audience. So once again, thank you for the thoughtful presentation. It definitely gave us a lot of ideas and a new viewpoint on Tolkien's writing, and especially in his writing style. And so then we can move on to our last presenter, Giovanni Costabile, who is an independent researcher from Italy. And the topic of his presentation is Tolkien's Joyful Sorrow, the Gift of Tears, so of Medieval Mysticism, and John Donne's sermon, Jesus Wept.
Thank you, Martina. Good morning. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. My presentation is going to be about something that appears especially in the ending of The Lord of the Rings. It's Joyful Sorrow. And at the field of Cormallen, some says, is everything sad going to come untrue? And this is a doubt on the very existence of sadness, a way by Tolkien to convey the impression of eucatastrophe or joy beyond the walls of the world, as he says on fairy stories. In On Fairy Stories, however, Tolkien also said about this joy that it is poignant as grief. And I think that the association and the comparison might seem peculiar, but it is actually part of a tradition that is well established in theology. And this joy brings tears, but these tears are the very wine of blessedness, as it says in The Lord of the Rings, in the key passage that I'm going to cite precisely. And all the host laughed and wept, and in the midst of their merriment and tears, the clear voice of the minstrel rose like silver and gold, and all men were hushed. And he sang to them, now in the Elven tongue, now in the speech of the West, until their hearts, wounded with sweet words, overflowed, and their joy was like swords. And they passed in thought out to regions where pain and delight flow together, and tears of the very wine of blessedness. In 2017, the scholar Dimitra Fimi from the University of Glasgow presented on the theme of joyful sorrow in The Lord of the Rings and associated it with Christian Orthodox karmolipi. That means precisely joyful sorrow. It comes from the treatise by John Climacus, The Ladder of Divine Ascent. And Fimi connects it to Christian joy, writing that it is the joy of God opposed to the joy of the world. Quote, John's gospel refers to the complete joy that only Christ can give. It is not to be found but in heaven, and we only get glimpses of it during our lives, end quote. And John Climacus, in The Ladder of Divine Ascent, talks about this joy grief. Literally, karmolipi would be translated joy grief. If you possess the gift of mourning, John Climacus writes, hold on to it with all your might. Greater than baptism itself is the fountain of tears after baptism, even though it is somewhat audacious to say so. For baptism is the washing away of evils that were in us before, but sins committed after baptism are washed away by tears. As baptism is received in infancy, we have all defiled it, but we cleanse it anew with tears. And if God, in his love for mankind, had not given us tears, few indeed and hard to find would be those in a state of grace. Groanings and sorrows cry to the Lord. Tears shed from fear intercede for us, but tears of all holy love, so as that our prayer has been accepted. If nothing goes so well with humility as mourning, certainly nothing is so opposed to it as laughter. Keep a firm hold of the blessed joy grief of holy compunction, and do not stop working at it until it raises you high above the things of this world and presents you pure to Christ. End quote. According to Orthodox tradition, to which this author belongs, Holy Saturday is the day of the Anastasis, that is the ascent to heaven of Christ with the soul he saved from hell, as a previous presenter, Prágerová, was saying. In the harrowing of hell, Jesus smashes the gates of hell and wins triumph over the power of the devil. This tradition in France is represented by the allegorical comments to Ovid's Metamorphoses that are presented in the Ovid Moralize. And these comments connect the Anastasis to Orpheus, that parallels Christ in a figural interpretation. The happy ending to Orpheus' endeavors can be found in medieval England in the Middle English poem Sir Orfeo, that connects well to the Ovid Moralize because, of course, Christ as Orpheus would be an Orpheus that finds a happy ending. And this is precisely what Tolkien gives us in his story of Beren and Lúthien. And the story of Beren and Lúthien well connects to the notion of joyful sorrow from the start, since at the beginning of the 19th chapter of the Silmarillion, one reads, "Among the tales of sorrow and of ruin that come down to us from the darkness of those days, there are yet some in which amid weeping there is joy, and under the shadow of death, light that endures." And even in the tale itself, Beren is slain at once by bliss and grief, and Lúthien's anguish was greater than any other, but together they experience a joy that nobody else had ever had so great. And in the Lay of Lúthien, we read about the price of woe and anguish that they pay for their bliss, and a new life and new pain that he has slain Beren, that finds a counterpart in the binding chain of living love and mortal pain that is forged by fate for both lovers when Lúthien reciprocates him. I think that also the song that Lúthien sings to Mandos, even if it does not Tolkien does not explicitly mention joy in this context, but being the most beautiful song that ever was sung, it surely was the cause of the highest joy in its achieving the happy ending for the couple. And sorry, the Song of Lúthien before Mandos, I think that may perhaps be inspired by the song that Mary Magdalene sings in the Homilia Origenis de Maria Magdalena, that was attributed to Origen, but in a Middle English version is also attributed to Geoffrey Chaucer. And as we know from John Bauer's 2019 book, Tolkien was an expert on Chaucer, who studied him extensively, especially the Pardoner's Tale, and he was the Middle English author on which Tolkien, to which Tolkien dedicated the greatest attention, together with the Gawain poet. And in this work attributed to Chaucer, Mary mourns Jesus in lines that parallel the Song of Songs. The version that has been attributed to Chaucer was also edited by Bertram Skeets in 1897, the daughter of Walter William Skeet, who's the eminent philologist that Tolkien saw as a role model. Again, this is all in John Bauer's book. In this work titled The Lamentation of Mary Magdalene, Magdalene searches for Jesus as the Shulamite sought Solomon in the Song of Songs. She calls him Lord, and master, but also spouse, love, and lover, and repeatedly. And she says that she would like to be the ointment that anointed him, and also that she would like to be nailed to the cross as he was. And eucatastrophe is essentially connected with miracles and the joy they cause. This is especially expressed by Tolkien when, in a letter, he tells us about the sermon by Father Douglas Carter that he listened to, and that one day when he was cycling with his daughter Priscilla back from St. Gregory's Church, they talked about this sermon and the fact that miracles happen unexpectedly, like eucatastrophe. And this is something of which we have an example in the Hobbit, in the Coming of the Eagles, but it is expressed by Tolkien in this letter as something that produces the essential emotion of Christian joy, that produces tears because it is qualitatively sorrow, because it comes from those places where joy and sorrow are at one, reconciled as selfishness and altruism are lost in love, end quote. But Tolkien, Dimitra Fimi may well be right that he was inspired by John Climacus, but he may also be inspired by the Western tradition, the Latin tradition, that also has a notion of joyful sorrow. In Augustine, we find the idea that the sadness of a Christian believer is bliss. And also there's the notion of Felix Culpa, the fortunate fall, as in the Catholic Paschal Vigil Mass Exalted, that says, I translate, "O happy fault that made us deserve so great, so glorious a Redeemer." Also in Ambrose of Milan, there's the idea that the fall of Adam was resulted in a greater benefit for mankind. And Augustine also says that it brought out a good that was greater than the evil. Also, Thomas Aquinas says that God allows evil to happen in order to bring a greater good therefrom, in the Summa Theologia. But it is especially in the Middle Ages that we find the tradition of, in the tradition of medieval mysticism, the idea of blessed tears. This is found in a treatise by John of Fecamp entitled Confessio Theologica, and in other authors that we're going to examine. All these authors express an idea of gratia lacrimarum, or the grace of tears, or donum lacrimarum, that is the gift of tears. In John of Fecamp, we read, for example, that by the effusion of the precious blood of Jesus, we are redeemed, and this gives us a contrition of heart and the fountain of tears. The fountain of tears recalls Tolkien's description of the Vala Ulmo, because in the Silmarillion we read, quote, "In the deep places he gives thought to music great and terrible, and the echo of that music runs through all the veins of the world in sorrow and in joy. For if joyful is the fountain that rises in the sun, its springs are in the wells of sorrow and fathom at the foundations of the earth," end quote. And this also parallels a German Arthurian poet, Wolfram von Eschenbach, from the beginning of the 13th century, who in his Wilhelm writes, "Sorrow is the floor of joy and the ceiling. Joy is walled by sorrow on the sides, behind and in front." And also says, "Who does not know that joy is bounded by sorrow?" And another quote, "After sorrow, joy often follows. Joy has that well-known habit with men and women. Yet in sorrow was our beginning, and with sorrow we come to the grave." In the medieval mystic Catherine of Siena from Tuscany, we read that when we weep tears that flow from a will made perfectly one with God, we find ourselves clothed in charity that weeps when God is offended at our neighbor's hurt. She talks about 5 varieties of tears, one of which is the tears of fire of the Holy Spirit, that are experienced, according to Jesse Gatzel, both by those who cannot weep outwardly on this earth and also by the saints and angels in heaven. So there is an idea that there is crying in heaven as well. And also Walter Hilton, an Augustinian canon from the 14th century, in the Ladder of Perfection, also expresses an idea of blessed sorrow. Margery Camp, the English mystic who wrote the book of Margery Camp, that is probably the first English biography in English literary history, also expressed the idea of blessed sorrow, because she said that tears may flow from grace. And while we have no evidence that Tolkien read these authors, we have no evidence that he read John Climacus either. Instead, he owned the first volume of the 1940 edition of the Book of Margery Camp, and it is discussed whether he knows from Eschenbach, because we know that he read German Arthurian authors, and so he probably knew Wilhelm as well. This is all found in Tolkien's library by Oronzo Cilli. Now coming to the early modern period, John Donne wrote a sermon that is called Jesus Wept, wherein he wrote, "And when God shall come to the last act in the glorifying of man, when he promises to wipe all tears from the eyes, what shall God have to do with the eye that never wept?" And one cannot but think of Gandalf saying, "Well, here at last, dear friends, on the shores of the sea, comes the end of our fellowship in Middle Earth. Go in peace, I will not say, do not weep, for not all tears are an evil." Donne also talks of the different kinds of tears, and he speaks of human tears, prophetical tears, and pontifical tears. And then comes close to expressing the same notion of joyful sorrow as Tolkien's. To conceive through sorrow and to joy, writes Donne, are things not only continuous, but continual. They do not only touch and follow one another in a certain succession. Joy assuredly offers sorrow, but they consist together. They are all one, joy and sorrow. My tears have been my meat day and night, says David. Not that he had no other meat, but none relished so well. And it is indifferent when we come to godly sorrow, whether we call it sorrow or joy, weeping or singing. Also, other authors in this period talked about Christ's weeping, so it was a concern of the period. And for example, Williams Whiteley states the godly sorrow is the mother of sound joy, and holy tears are the proper seeds of heavenly comfort. Also, John Milton speaks of the kingdom of Christ as paternal sorrow or paternal joy, mild severity, melting compassion. And again, Oronzo Cilli documents that Tolkien owned 5 volumes of works by John Donne, one of which was the 1919 Clarendon Press edition of Donne's sermons. So, to conclude, Tolkien's joyful sorrow may have been well inspired by Orthodox Greek notions of Karmolipi. However, there is also a tradition that is relevant to the West, a tradition of mysticism that is expressly found in medieval mysticism, in the works, for example, of John of Fecamp, Catherine of Siena, Walter Hilton, and Margery Camp. Also, the Wilhelm by Wolfram von Eschenbach offers an example of joyful sorrow in in literature instead than in religious writing. And in the early modern period, there are the writings of William Whiteley, John Milton, especially John Donne, with his sermon Jesus Wept, where he advocates the identifications of holy sorrow and holy joy. And as a consequence, we might be able to consider a wider range of sources for this notion of Tolkien, that joy and sorrow all come from the same place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Are there any questions? If not, then maybe I have just like final remark that it's nice how the presentations were today kind of interrelated. A couple of them were drawing on like Christian sources and theological sources, and they were related also in terms of discussing, for example, here Giovanni also mentioned what Lenka was talking about, the relationship between Lúthien, or the quest of Lúthien and Beren. So it's nicely interconnected with each other. And it's been quite a long evening, afternoon, so I'm happy and thankful to all the presenters for their participation. And hopefully we will see each other next year again.
Thank you.
Okay, so goodbye.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.